All right. Much of the evidence about water, the water levels, ocean levels on the Earth, is in favor of higher sea levels today than in the past. Let's go back to K39. There you go. Look for most of the evidence in favor of. So, the terraces are as difficult to explain in terms of supposed former higher sea levels, which evolutionists also propose. Most of the evidence in favor of higher sea levels is supposedly provided by terrace and shoreline features which now occupy elevated positions all over the world. But the alternative possibility exists that continental margins and interiors have actually risen positively rather than the sea level. If there were freshly created shoreline features widely distributed along maritime coasts at some comparatively uniform level, such as 200 feet, the argument that today's sea level represents a lowering by that amount would be strong. On the other hand, if shoreline features stand at a variety of elevations, which is the case, the suggestion is fairly conclusive that elevation has resulted from differential elevation of rising land masses. The latter appears to be the case. Furthermore, if there were more than one glacial period, which evidence does not support, then the hypothesis that higher sea levels produced a supposed interglacial period when there was a melting down of the glaciers between glacial periods would still not be supported by the evidence. Richard J. Russell states further that interglacial seas at times may have exceeded today's stand, and that's possible if there were more than one glacial period, but not by the differences of level suggested by positions of higher terraces, for many of these surfaces are located above the level which would be established if all continental ice should melt. Thus, the height of the raised river terraces can only be explained in terms of intermittent uplift processes, such as terminated the deluge period. And the width of the valleys and the great depth of alluvial fill can only be reasonably explained in terms of great swollen rivers plunging rapidly toward the sea as the waters of the great deluge drained out. This evidence from the most thoroughly explored continental shelf on Earth refutes the physiographer's lateral corrosion hypothesis for the lower Mississippi Valley and an erosional explanation for the shelf. A deeply alluviated major valley leads to a deeply blanketed shelf. The flatness is depositional rather than erosional in both cases. Richard J. Russell. Further proof that the rivers formerly carried much larger quantities of water is found in the great size of their original channels as cut out of the bedrock. Just look at the rocks below. Colorado River is far smaller than the bedrock of the bottom of the canyon that it occupies. As has already been stated, the bed widths of the filled channels are some 10 times those of the present channels in the same localities. The whole of the present annual precipitation, with no loss or percolation or evaporation, could similarly have been run off in no more than 5 days. It is therefore necessary to postulate a form of precipitation greater and probably considerably greater than that which is now recorded. G.H. Drury. Theory, model tests, and field observations all demonstrated that there is a definite limit to the width of a stream's meander belt, and this is always much less than the width of the alluvial plain in which it flows. Gerard Mathis. Mention should also be made of the old marine shorelines that are now found all around the world's seacoasts. As we have noted, these raised beaches are found so universally that they have been considered the chief evidence of eustatic, worldwide variations in sea level. In various parts of the world, elevated strand lines and terraces exist, which are believed to have had a marine origin. If these were local phenomena, their positions above sea level could be explained as the result of local diastrophism, but they are so worldwide in extent that they seem to be related to eustatic rise in sea level rather than to local uplift. Thornberry. Glacial geologists have long been intrigued with the idea of correlating these old beaches with the supposed interglacial warm periods when the ice sheets had melted and filled the oceans to a higher level. But in spite of intense study directed to this end, such correlation has proved quite elusive. Finally, if we evolutionists can follow continuously a stream of terraces all over a river valley and see them united on the one hand with moraines, glacial deposits, and on the other with ancient shores, the whole problem of correlation is solved. Unfortunately, and contrary to expectation, it is extremely difficult to follow fluviatile river-formed terraces continuously from the region of moraines, glacial deposits, as far as marine shows, as former marine shores. One is warranted, therefore, in suspecting that the multiglacial hypothesis may perhaps be wrong. After all, uniformitarianism, no. Although the old marine shorelines are found all around all the continents, they can reflect universal continental uplift processes just as well as higher sea levels. In fact, their irregularity, their varying number from place to place, and the great elevation of some of them strongly favor the former explanation, as Russell pointed out. Worldwide flood. Former evidence of former lower sea levels. There does appear to be much evidence of a former lower sea level. The topography of the continental shelves, look at them. The irregularity of the coastlines, the great submarine canyons, the seamount similarities between faunas of now separated areas. Many other factors seem to indicate that they were formed at least in a part of at a time when the sea level was relatively lower by several hundred feet than it is at present. Look at that from a satellite image of all the continents. Shallow seas comes out, and then in depth, every one of these continents, 7 continents. So if that water weren't there, the continents would have would have the deeper seas, and we'd have a higher, lower sea level. The continental shelves themselves are evidence of a former lower sea level, since their edges mark the true boundaries between ocean basins and continental blocks. The continental shelf extends out as much as 750 miles, with an average width of about 42 miles. Then it descends gradually to a maximum depth of from about 300 feet to about 1,500 feet, with a mean depth of about 430. Beyond the shelf, the continental slope then descends to the ocean depths. As already noted, most evidence favors the view that the continental blocks were uplifted, or the ocean basins subsided, or both, by a great fault along the continental slope. This is too much. How about a worldwide flood? This, of course, accords quite well with the biblical implication that the uplift of the lands coincident with the subsidence of the ocean basins marked the terminus of the universal inundation, worldwide flood. Why don't they say that? Caused by the Great Flood. This uplift of fault slippage along the edge of the granite blocks of the continents was intermittent, largely being completed during the flood year, but evidently continuing on a lesser scale for many centuries to come. The present continental shelf could well define the edge of the oceans as they developed during the glacial period. The best calculations for the depth of ocean lowering during the so-called Pleistocene era, due to the water locked in continental ice sheets seem to be of the same order of magnitude as the average depth, 430 feet, of the edge of the shelf. Now, while the melting of the ice sheets, Charlesworth says, the oceans rose to their present level, and with minor fluctuations, have remained at that level since. Uniformitarianism, no. Now, but not before. The ocean basins can thus be characterized as overfull. Water not only fills the ocean basins proper, but extends out over the low margins of the continents, all around the edges. You can see satellite images. Shallow seas pop off to deeper waters. Trumbull, Lyman, Pepper, Thompson. There's even some evidence of the past lowering of sea levels to much greater depths than that of the continental shelf. These evidences include the great depth of some of the submarine canyons and some of the flat-top seamounts, for both of which there is strong evidence for formation above sea level. Yes, and the many freshwater and shallow water deposits found in recent years in deep-sea sediments. Convincing evidence should eventually be forthcoming that the sea level actually was several thousand feet lower than at present, as some of these data seem to indicate. Then it would appear that the only logical explanation of such lowering would be simply that there was no more water in the ocean at that time. In other words, there must have been the antediluvian sea level. Yeah. It is obvious that the immense amount of missing water involved in this amount of lowering could not have been frozen in a great ice sheet, and there seems no other way of explaining where it could be. And if the second alternative is chosen, that a relatively sudden increase of 30% in the volume of the ocean, the compelling question of the source of this water must be faced, and this few geologists can bring themselves to do. Why don't you just rule it out? Consider it, rule it out if you can, but you can't. But the problem becomes simple. If the existence of the antediluvian waters above the firmament precipitated at the time of the deluge is accepted, then there would be a problem, but they don't want to consider it. So, we've completed an investigation of the worldwide flood. What does it point to? A recent creation. Short period of time. The water itself formed instantly. All of those marvelous rock strata with fossils in them at varying places, not according to the textbook. All kinds of explanations you can squirm around, but the best explanation is a whole lot of water.